pleasure it is to be with everyone this afternoon. Amanda, thanks for acknowledging my 1-year anniversary. I think that one of the most fascinating and fulfilling parts of my work over the past year has been learning and reinforcing the depth of Convergence's connection with this broader field of people and organizations that are focused on combating polarization in America and bridging across some of these divides, specifically working to change attitudes and behaviors of people toward those with whom they disagree. After all, at Convergence, we first build trust and find common ground across those divides before we're able to really move forward toward forging consensus solutions. Among leaders in the bridging field are the researchers who leverage lessons from past successes and failures, both from an international context and a domestic context. And they do work from peacemaking and violence prevention, and they're all bringing people together across fraught divides. So I'm thrilled to introduce you today to Rachel Brown, who's a distinguished leader in this space and who's helped all of us put brain science to use in becoming more effective at this work. For about a decade, Rachel's work has focused on using communications to prevent violent conflict. She's the author of Diffusing Hate, a strategic communication guide to counteract dangerous speech. And she was a 2014 fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Simon Jode Center for the Prevention of Genocide. Rachel previously founded and ran a Kenyan nonprofit organization that pioneered new strategies to build local capacity for peace building and civic engagement. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you so much, David. It's very exciting to be here with Convergence.
Thank you. So let's cut to the end of our discussion. What do you hope at the end of our discussion will be one or two things that you'd really like to make sure the leaders that are here take away?
Wow. I guess one big picture thing that I'm a big believer in is sort of what, as somebody that comes from the world of practice and then has really jumped into the world of research and works at the intersection of the two of them, I think and really see and believe how understanding everything from brain science to social psychology to historical case studies and the study of conflict can teach us how many different inroads we have to solve the problems that we see today. It can help us see them in their full complexity, and it can help expand our menus of options for doing the work. So I hope that you can have an expanded sense of the possible, and also some thinking about groups and how they function and how we as humans act and engage once we're part of groups and what that means for what it takes to have an impact.
So let's go a little bit deeper into that. What do you think we should you wish everyone would know about the types of toxic polarization that exist and how they operate and what that means for the groups that we're a part of?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the really key things to understand is that us versus them conflict and rupture and division is really different than a me versus you conflict or division, right? David, if you and I are arguing about something, that's a me versus you context. Once we're in an us versus them context, a whole lot of other dynamics come alive. And we have to address not just conflict between individuals or even just conflict between groups. We have to address the dynamics that are going on within groups, and we have to address the sort of landscape of us and them that exists. And I think there's a couple of things maybe to anchor that understanding in. One is that we are literally and physically wired for belonging. We feel exclusion in the same part of our brain that registers physical pain. People argue that belonging, being part of a group, should actually be the absolute foundation for Maslow's hierarchy of need, because we find food, we find shelter, and all of these things by belonging with other people, by collaborating as a group. So we're very social creatures. We have all these built-in things in our brain that we're sensitive to rejection. We're sensitive to what we think most members of our group are doing and to the social pressures of our group. So when we get into an us versus them divide, it's not just about how do I feel about the other group. It's also about the social pressures that are being exerted on me within my group, right? And then we have to remember that it's not preordained what the us versus them looks like in a society, right? I have a million different identities that I could come up with. I'm a Baltimorean. I grew up in Baltimore, right? So I'm an Orioles fan. I'm a peace builder. I'm a Tufts alum. I'm a woman. I'm Jewish. I have all these parts of my identity that become salient to me at different points in time, depending on whether they're under threat, right? Depending on how much they're meeting my needs or being activated in a given moment. And when we get in this really toxic cycle of polarization, we not only have really strong pressures towards division within our own groups, we also step into these very singular and rigid versions of the us, right? We activate just on one or a few parts of our identity, whether that's political ideology, race, religion, et cetera, and we lose those cross-cutting ties. And I think embedded in all of this is threat. We're really sensitive to threat. Again, this is for survival, right? We are made to be sensitive to threat and we have emotions like fear and like disgust because they help us move away from threats. They help us deal with threats. But when other groups of people are portrayed in the media by leaders, et cetera, as a threat, it's really, really dangerous, right? Because we have a whole set of actions that we become willing to take. And when we live in a political environment that is constantly activating us into this threat state, we cling more closely to our own groups. We're more sensitive to threats. We're more willing to take action against another group. And so these things feed each other in really harmful cycles if we don't interrupt them.
That makes a lot of sense. I could imagine us spending a lot of time going deeper into both the root causes and the manifestations of this kind of toxic polarization. Let's jump more into the solutions for a moment. What do you think are the essential learnings that science teaches us about how we best facilitate people coming together?
Yeah. So I think it can be really tempting when we see this rupture between groups to say, what do we do to bring people together across groups? And that's really important. But I think what the science helps us do is see a more complete picture and helps us know that our job isn't just about bringing people together across the groups that they've been divided into. It's also about changing that landscape of us versus them. It's making the us less singular and less rigid. It's activating more different identities that connect us to different people across various dividing lines and making those salient. And it's also about addressing the within group dynamics, right? So it's not just the work across groups, it's the work of saying, what are the groups that are going to exist in this society? How are we drawing those boundaries? And how are we making more identities that connect us to each other salient? And how are we shifting the pressures within the groups that we do belong to away from division, away from unhealthy conflict, away from these narratives of the other as threat? And then when we've done that, we can also start to address some of these feedback cycles that once we're divided, once we see another group as a threat, there's all these feedback cycles. Everything that another group does, we say, they're acting out of hate, but we're acting out of love, right? People reliably across conflict contexts think that their side is acting out of love, but the other side is acting out of hate. So you can see how that starts to fuel the division. So we want to cut off the feedback cycles, but I think we can just really expand our menu of options for how to address this problem. And if we want the cross-group work to stick, we have to remember that people operate with belonging. How are they finding a space of belonging within that cross-group work? And how do they have the tools to address the within-group pressures that they might face?
Thanks, Rachel. I want to invite folks to share questions in chat, and Rachel and I will work to get to them, although I expect this is going to feel lightning fast by the time we're done. Rachel, your description just now of broadening and complexifying sort of the we makes me wonder whether you would see that as part of Convergence's strength, that through our long dialogue processes, we're actually building new kind of identities where people see themselves as part of the Convergence group. Could that be part of why we're experiencing success? And while I'm asking the question, let me just go a little bit deeper. What else might you attribute some of our success to?
I think that piece is critical. And I also think it's important. That doesn't just happen because you bring people together over a long period of time, right? Groups become salient and important for us when we have some sort of shared identification of threat. And an easy way to do that is fear mongering, is saying they're out to get you, it's zero sum. But I think that the threat that Convergence identifies is the inability to move forward on critical challenges. And you're bringing together people that really care about those challenges, right? So there is sort of a shared threat identification with a really credible process and set of tools for people to address something that's important to them and also meet needs and aspirations, which is another thing that makes a group salient. And they're meeting regularly over time. So there's all these things that start to make that cohort. I haven't been part of a Convergence, long-term process, but I imagine it might have the feeling of like a high school graduating class or something, right? You have a little bit of your spirit for your year. And so I think that it's, I would imagine that that's a really critical piece of it, that it's not just bringing people together in their sort of confrontational identities. As you disagree, talk about what you disagree about. It's bringing people together over a shared value. It's anchoring a sort of shared identity in that. It's showing them what progress looks like. So it's credibly meeting needs and aspirations, and there's an outcome there, right? It's not just talking about it. People are doing things together. And so they experience a set of needs or goals being met through that collective work. And then also imagine, because you have such a diverse group of people, most people, and you can tell me if I'm wrong here, but most people that go through a Convergence experience probably have others that they might, prior to that experience, identify as being within their own group, right? Falling on sort of the same side as them. So they also have peers. I think one of the things that makes the within group work really hard is that people often feel very alone. So if people have peers that are coming from a similar, at least, stance on an issue prior, and they have those peer relationships to navigate, bring that back into their own space and their own group, then that's really important. And I imagine that the way that you're having conversations starts to undercut some of those cross-group feedback cycles. So people are learning that somebody, not just what stance they take on an issue, but what are the values and what are the stories behind that. That starts to cut out some of that, what I was describing of they're acting out of hate, we're acting out of love, that they call it motive attribution asymmetry.
Right. Peter, you have a question?
Yeah, I do. That's been fascinating. The question I have is about this notion of reducing the feedback cycle. And in the age of media disinformation and social media exploding, how do you do that? Seems like a monumental challenge.
Yeah, it is. It's a monumental challenge. And what we have to remember is that there are monumental resources being poured into the problem. It's not just coming out of nowhere, and it's not just organic. And so, of course, it's going to take a fair amount of effort to push back. That said, a lot of that disinformation stokes fear, right? This gets to understanding what we talked about with threat. A lot of it feeds narratives that we know are really, really problematic for conflict. Things like they hate us, right? They see us as less than human. When we understand what those feedback cycles are, at least we can start to work to match to them, to match responses that will effectively cut them off. And so I think the first step is really understanding what are those feedback cycles so that we can recognize the type of communication, disinformation, whatever it is, that will cut them off. But the deeper answer to your question is, I think, also structural, because it's not just can we put out the right content. It's also about the structures of trust that exist in a society. Who are the messengers that are out there that are able to reach people? And who are the key sort of trusted different types of leaders that are being activated to engage in pushing back on the set of problematic narratives. And I think that that's where it comes to a strategy of who is being engaged and the types of relationships that they have, and the types of messengers that we're able to activate and engage around this work really matters.
Rachel, we're pushing on time. So what I'm going to do is quickly share 2 questions, then let Rachel and Micah add their questions, and then give you the final word, responding as you can to what'll be different questions. One was, do you know, given that we're having increasingly segmented and segregated media and information systems, are there fewer shared media experiences? Can we achieve scale in causing change through that kind of this kind of work? Another question would be, what are the words and phrases that are most likely to be helpful either in reducing or in hurting on the polarization front? Micah, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Also, hi, Rachel. One of the things that you were talking about was the importance of creating shared identity and this sort of like transcendent or sort of cross-cutting identity and sense of belonging. And in my work as a musician, like specifically, I know that the role of music, and I would say the arts and culture more broadly, is often to define and to give emotional weight to that sense of belonging and a sense of shared identity in a bajillion ways. I would just be interested in what role you see like music and or the arts and culture like potentially playing as like a different way of accessing some of those feelings than just a spoken conversation.
Wow.
Rachel, I know you can't get to all of those, and would love if you have a sort of summary thoughts, and we'll find an opportunity to go deeper into some of those maybe other questions that we could, and then share that out.
Absolutely. So to the question on the segmented media environment, I think the key thing there is to think about a diverse set of influential messengers and leaders. I mean, this is really, if everyone's not tuning into the same channel, what's the array of channels, and how are you making sure that you're activating leaders and messengers across those different channels to reach diverse audiences, and that they're anchored to some sort of baseline shared commitment or set of values. That is way easier said than done. I think we often think about building commitment and building capacity, but I think that a lot of spaces that get dismissed as saying, well, people in that group don't care about this, you will find that there are leaders who aren't comfortable with how things are going, want to be engaging. We've seen this a lot, want to be engaging and speaking out, but feel really, really alone. So connecting them with peers so that they feel like they have their own support network to use their platform is really key. On the question of words, I will say it's so context specific, and the meaning of words even changes over time, and take like the word mask has a weight now that it wouldn't have 2 years ago. So there's so much to talk about, and I want to put a pin in it for whatever next conversation that we get to have together, because there's probably too much in the short time. But we'll put in the chat some of the patterns of ideas that we see. And on the last question of music, this is a beautiful thing to end on, because I think it's really important to remember that so much of this is emotional, right? This is about people's felt experiences. This is about where people feel belonging, where they feel threat, how they make sense of the world. And if you look at how even sort of extreme or violent movements recruit music, bonfires, right? You can think back to the way that the Nazis used youth like scouts camps and celebratory events, right? That creates a sense of belonging and bonding, and it is not an accident. And so I think that giving attention to that emotional piece of what we see going on, and finding a way to leverage not just words and sort of stay all in our heads as we create those cross-cutting spaces, but find ways to tap into and engage emotions, it is a really powerful and important point.
Rachel, thank you so much. I'll share with folks something that we hadn't planned on saying publicly, which is Rachel and I are going to do a video chat, which we'll be releasing. And so the questions that we didn't get to go fully enough into, including an amazing question from Rachel first, we will do in the context of that video and make sure that everyone has an opportunity to see it. In the meantime, Rachel, thank you so much. You've really given us a lot to chew on.
Thank you so much.